Kratos did not spend his life simply trying to control his anger. He was trying to prevent the feeling beneath it from returning: helplessness. Rage gave that helplessness somewhere to go. It turned grief into action, shame into punishment, and fear into command. For a long time, that strategy kept him alive. But once Kratos became a father again, the same pattern began to damage the relationship he most wanted to protect. In this episode, we are going to look at Kratos as more than an angry warrior who became calmer with age. We will examine what his control protected him from, why emotional honesty was often more difficult for him than combat, and what might have changed if therapy had entered his life before silence became his main way of protecting Atreus. The goal would not be to make Kratos softer, remove the warrior from him, or pretend that his past could be forgiven through a few conversations. Therapy would ask a more difficult question. Had control become his only reliable language for love, and had punishing himself forever started to replace genuine responsibility? The pattern began long before the fall of Olympus. Sons of Sparta matters because it places Kratos beside Deimos before gods, revenge, and catastrophe define his identity. As a young Spartan, strength was not simply useful, it was belonging. Duty meant protecting the person beside you, and failure meant that someone could be taken while your hands were empty. When Deimos was lost, that lesson did not disappear. It became more rigid. Kratos learned to associate love with responsibility for another person's survival. If someone he cared about suffered, the failure felt personal. Greater strength, stricter discipline, and tighter control began to feel like the only possible answers. Ares later exploited that same structure. Kratos offered obedience in exchange for power, and power turned his loyalty against everything he valued. After the destruction of his first family, his suffering was no longer only grief, it carried the logic of moral injury. He was not asking only why something terrible had happened to him, he was asking what his own actions proved that he was. Revenge gave that question a simple answer. If he was a monster, then monsters could become the target. Olympus gave him enemies large enough to contain his anger, but no victory could repair the meaning he had built around himself. The Greek world eventually fell behind him, yet the sentence continued because Kratos carried the judge with him. When he entered the Norse lands, he looked different. He was older, quieter, and far more restrained. But restraint is not the same as integration. A person can stop acting impulsively while still organizing his life around the same fear. With Atreus, Kratos often gives instructions before he gives context. He teaches his son how to survive, but he withholds the emotional history that would make those lessons easier to understand. He warns Atreus about power, anger, gods, and destiny, yet he rarely explains how deeply those subjects frighten him. That is not because Atreus matters too little. It is because he matters enough to activate every previous failure. Kratos fears that truth will burden his son, that power will corrupt him, and closeness will make another loss impossible to survive. Silence, therefore, begins to feel like protection. But silence also prevents Kratos from being fully known. This is the cycle a clinically informed therapist might notice. Attachment fear creates vigilance. Vigilance becomes control. Control creates distance. Distance produces guilt. That guilt then convinces Kratos that he must become even more careful, even more guarded, and even more controlling. The anger is real, but it is only one part of the system. The deeper defense is over-control. Therapy would have to begin by respecting what that defense accomplished. It kept Kratos functional. It helped him survive repeated loss. It limited impulsive violence in the Norse years, and it helped him keep Atreus alive in a dangerous world. If a therapist attacked that defense too quickly, Kratos would probably leave. He would hear criticism where the therapist intended curiosity. A better approach would be to ask what the defense now costs. The main intervention would be narrative reauthoring. Kratos would be asked to tell the same life twice. First, he would describe it as evidence that he is permanently a monster. Then, he would describe the same events as evidence of what he is now responsible for preventing, repairing, and teaching differently. Nothing factual would be erased. His family would still be gone. Olympus would still have fallen. Innocence would not be restored. What could change is the conclusion. Then the therapist would ask the question Kratos cannot answer through discipline or violence. When you call yourself a monster, what responsibility does that permanent verdict allow you to avoid tomorrow? Self-hatred can feel morally serious. It can create the impression that someone has not forgotten the harm they caused, but it can also become a hiding place. If Kratos decides that he can never become anything except a monster, then failure has already been decided. He never has to risk becoming a better father while knowing that he may still make mistakes. He can continue punishing himself instead of accepting the uncertainty of change. The first difference therapy would create would be immediate and specific. Kratos would tell Atreus the truth earlier. He would not describe every violent detail, and he would not turn disclosure into a confession that forces his son to comfort him. He would offer a bounded truth that gives Atreus enough context to understand himself. He might say, "There are things I have done that frighten me. You deserve enough truth to understand where you come from. My past is not your instruction, and my fear will not decide who you become." Atreus might still react badly. He could become angry, test his power, reject limits, or make dangerous choices. Therapy would not remove his autonomy or guarantee obedience. What it would change is the context around those choices. Instead of discovering major truths only during crisis, Atreus would know why his father feared power. He would be able to distinguish inheritance from destiny and understand that Kratos' warnings came from experience rather than simple mistrust. Over the following months, Kratos would have to practice something more difficult for him than command: negotiation. Before issuing an order, he would name the danger and ask what Atreus understood. When they disagreed, distance would no longer automatically mean that the bond had failed. Atreus would have less reason to hide decisions simply to prove that they were his. Mimir would no longer need to translate every emotion Kratos refused to name. Freya would meet a man more capable of speaking about grief and revenge without pretending that suffering made him morally superior. Their relationships would not become peaceful or effortless. A healthier bond is one that is not without conflict. It is one in which conflict does not immediately threaten the relationship itself. The long-term result would not be a quiet retirement or a perfectly healed Kratos. He would remain severe, vigilant, and capable of force. Under serious threat, he would still be tempted to return to command and emotional withdrawal. But after Ragnarök and Valhalla, he could become a different kind of leader. Not a ruler whose authority comes from being the strongest person in the room, but a deliberative protector, someone who listens before deciding, shares responsibility, and places limits on force because he understands what happens when strength answers only to pain. He could mentor younger warriors without teaching them that usefulness requires emotional erasure. He could show them that discipline and vulnerability are not opposites. and that questioning authority is sometimes part of responsible service. He could also allow Atreus to build a life beyond him without reading independence as abandonment. Their relationship could remain stable because neither disagreement nor distance would automatically mean rejection. Kratos' chosen family could become durable not because conflict disappeared, but because truth no longer arrived only after crisis. He would still struggle to ask for support. Some guilt would remain because some losses cannot be repaired. He would occasionally confuse vigilance for responsibility and return to old habits when frightened. The difference is that the old pattern would no longer make every decision for him. That is what therapy could realistically change.
Not the past, not the warrior, the meaning Kratos gives to both, and the kind of future he believes he is allowed to build. This has been a fictional, non-clinical interpretation of the character rather than a diagnosis. It is one way of reading the story through attachment, shame, moral responsibility, and the psychology of change. Which moment do you think would have changed Kratos the most? Telling Atreus the truth earlier? Allowing him to leave without turning distance into rejection? Or accepting leadership without treating it as another punishment? Write your answer in the comments and tell me which character should enter the therapy room in the next episode. Subscribe to follow the series and see the next story examined from inside the therapy room.